At 7:15 on Veterans Day evening, my son stood at the microphone in the Norfolk Veterans Hall and told 200 people that I had worn medals I did not earn. He did not look angry when he said it. He looked careful, almost tender, the way a man looks when he has practiced cruelty until it sounds like concern. The mayor sat at the front table. The commander of the local American Legion post sat beside him. A retired admiral, 2 reporters, the foundation board, and half my church were all facing the stage, waiting for me to prove him wrong or crumble where I sat. My son lifted the navy blue dress jacket from the back of a chair and held it beneath the lights. The silver eagle on the collar caught the room before my name did. "My mother has been confused since Dad passed," he said. "She has started telling people this was her uniform. She even let people believe these decorations belonged to her. Tonight is about real service, not memory problems. As a family, we are asking everyone to protect her dignity." Forks stopped moving. A chair scraped the floor. Someone whispered my name. I was seated near the kitchen doors because my daughter-in-law had moved my place card that afternoon. She told the volunteers I would be more comfortable away from the cameras. Comfortable was not the word for it. At the front table, my 11-year-old granddaughter, Claire, looked from her father to me with the frightened confusion of a child being handed a family story she did not know how to question. My son had the microphone. He had the printed program. He had my husband's portrait on the easel behind him, and the family table arranged like a verdict. I had a blue service binder in my lap. Inside it was my certified DD 214, my Navy Nurse Corps retirement orders, my award citation, and a letter with a raised seal from the National Personnel Records Center. Inside the side pocket was a microcassette my husband recorded 3 weeks before he died, and 2 tables behind my son sat the Marine whose life he had just called a lie. My knees knew I was 68. My spine remembered rank. I did not stand at once. I did not shout. I did not interrupt my son while he was still constructing the lie. Accusation has to finish speaking before evidence can answer. Before dessert was served, the same post commander who let my son continue would have to take that microphone and correct my rank in front of the room. Before the night ended, my granddaughter would hear her dead grandfather's voice tell the truth about the uniform her father had used to shame me. And before my son walked out of that hall, he would understand that silence was not the same thing as surrender. To understand why Mark believed he could erase me in a room full of veterans, you have to understand what I had allowed my family to inherit. Not money, not property, a simpler, more dangerous thing. I had allowed them to inherit my silence. I was born Evelyn Ruth Mercer in a little white house outside Roanoke, Virginia, where the trains came through at night and shook the window glass. My father repaired engines for the railroad and served in Korea before I was old enough to understand what that meant. My mother worked the church nursery, kept a vegetable garden, and taught me that a person's good name was easier to protect than repair. When I was 9, my father showed me a photograph of himself in uniform. He did not talk about battle. He talked about the men who never came home, the mothers who opened telegrams, and the sacred obligation to tell the truth about service. Never borrow another person's sacrifice, he told me, and never let anyone steal yours. I carried those words longer than I carried most things. I became a nurse because I liked practical mercy. It suited me. I wanted work that did not require applause. A nurse learns quickly that pain makes people honest, frightened, mean, grateful, and small, all in the same hour. You learn to steady your hands while other people's worlds collapse. I joined the Navy Nurse Corps at 23. My mother cried for 2 days. My father said nothing until the morning I left. He walked me to the bus station, handed me his old compass, and said, "There will be days when orders tell you where to go, but character tells you who to be. Keep both straight." That compass is still in my dresser drawer. I met Frank Mercer when I was 31 at Naval Medical Center, Portsmouth. He was a surface warfare officer with a broken wrist and a stubborn belief that he could return to duty before his bones agreed. I was the lieutenant who told him he could either follow medical instructions or explain to his captain why a nurse half his size had more sense than he did. He smiled at me from the exam table and said, "Ma'am, I believe I have met command authority." I liked him before, I trusted him. Trust took longer. Frank was warm where I was measured. He told stories easily. He remembered birthdays, shook hands with both hands, and could make the quietest person in a room feel noticed. We married in the base chapel on a rainy Saturday with 26 guests, a sheet cake, and my father's compass tied into my bouquet. For the first few years, we were a Navy marriage in the ordinary way. One of us was always leaving, returning, repacking, unpacking, or pretending not to count the days. We missed anniversaries. We celebrated Christmas in January. We learned that love in military life is less about grand romance and more about who pays the electric bill while the other person is on the other side of the world. Mark was born when I was 36. Frank held him first because I was too exhausted to lift my arms. He placed that red-faced little boy beside my cheek and whispered, "Your mother could command a fleet with that look." I laughed, and Mark's tiny fingers opened against my neck. I wish I could say motherhood made everything simple. It did not. I loved my son with a fierceness that frightened me, but the Navy did not pause because I had a cradle in the guest room. I returned to duty when Mark was still small enough to fit between my elbow and wrist. My mother came to help. Frank adjusted his schedule whenever he could. We made charts, lists, emergency numbers, backup plans, and promises we sometimes failed to keep. There were nights I sat in a barracks room with a telephone pressed to my ear, listening to Mark breathe because Frank had placed the receiver beside the crib. There were birthdays I missed, fevers I heard about after they broke, school plays where an empty chair represented me more honestly than any apology could. Frank never complained. Not to me. "He knows you love him," he would say, when guilt sat too heavily on my chest. But children know absence before they understand sacrifice. As Mark grew, Frank became the parent at field trips, Little League games, dentist appointments, and parent-teacher conferences. The teachers knew his face. The other parents knew his laugh. I was the mother in uniform who arrived late, left early, and hugged too tightly at airports. When Mark was 7, he asked me why I kept leaving. I was folding uniforms on the bed. He stood in the doorway in dinosaur pajamas, holding a plastic airplane in one hand. "Because I made a promise," I said. "To who?" "To my country. To the sailors and Marines who need me." His eyes narrowed in that serious way children have when a grown-up answer does not meet a child's need. "Did you promise me?" The question cut cleaner than he knew. I knelt in front of him. "Yes, baby. I promised you too." "Then why do they get you more?" I had no answer that would comfort a 7-year-old. Years later, that question would become the root of my son's anger. He did not remember the money I sent home, the letters I wrote, the recorded bedtime stories, the nights I cried into government pillows where no one could see. He remembered the chair I did not fill. He had a right to that wound. He did not have a right to turn it into a lie. My service was not glamorous. Most real service is not. I was not kicking down doors or starring in the kind of movie people make to simplify courage. I was a commissioned Navy nurse, later a flight nurse and nurse administrator, trained to move wounded bodies through chaos without letting chaos enter my hands. During Operation Desert Storm, I served in a combat support hospital and later on aeromedical evacuation missions. That language matters. I was not infantry. I did not pretend to be. But there were nights when sirens tore through the dark, when chemical alarms sounded, when young men arrived burned, bleeding, and calling for mothers who were thousands of miles away. There were flights where turbulence and pain medication and blood pressure numbers became the whole world. There were decisions made in seconds that lived with me for decades. One of those decisions involved a Marine named Thomas Alvarez. He was 24 then, a gunnery sergeant before he had the gray hair to match the title, though everybody called him Gunny because some men are born old in the best way. He came to us after a vehicle accident near a supply route during the war. His left leg was torn badly, his blood pressure dropping, his face the color of wet paper. A younger corpsman kept saying we were losing him. I remember his hand clamping around my wrist. "Don't let them send me home in a box, ma'am," he said. "Not today," I told him. That was not bravery. It was a promise made under bad lighting with blood on my sleeve. We stabilized him. We got him on the aircraft. Twice in the air, his pressure crashed. Twice we pulled him back. I wrote the times in my flight logbook because records matter when memory is later questioned. Years after the war, a formal review credited our evacuation team with saving multiple lives under hazardous conditions. My award citation did not make me special. It made the record accurate. I received the Bronze Star Medal for meritorious service in a combat zone, along with other campaign and service awards that belonged to my own uniform, my own name, and my own history. Frank was proud in a way that embarrassed me. At my promotion ceremony to captain, he stood in the front row with Mark, who was 14, and looking at the floor. Frank pinned one silver eagle on my shoulder. My commanding officer pinned the other. Afterward, Frank kissed my cheek and whispered, "Captain Mercer, I am going to be impossible to live with after this." He kept a photograph of that day in his desk for the rest of his life. Mark barely looked at it. Teenagers have their own weather. His was resentment with occasional sunshine. When I returned from deployments, he was polite but distant. He preferred Frank for advice, Frank for rides, Frank for jokes, Frank for everything that required an everyday parent. I told myself not to take it personally. I had chosen service. Choices have invoices. Still, I tried. I wrote to him from every place I could. I sent postcards with ships, monuments, desert sunsets, and ugly airport carpet. I saved the programs from events I missed and wrote notes on the back. I made pancakes when I was home because Frank once told me Mark bragged about my pancakes at school. By the time Mark left for college, we were kind to each other in the way some families are kind when they have lost the language for tenderness. Frank retired first. I followed 6 years later, after 31 years in uniform. My retirement ceremony was modest because I asked for modest. Frank wanted music, speeches, and a reception large enough to require parking attendance. I told him I had spent my life caring for people who had endured far more than applause could hold. A small ceremony would do. Mark came with his new wife, Paige. Paige was polished, pretty, and practical in a way that felt sharp at the edges. She had grown up around donors and nonprofit boards. Her father had been a state senator. She knew how to say the right thing while measuring the usefulness of everyone in the room. At my retirement reception, she kissed my cheek and said, "This is lovely, Evelyn." So understated. I thanked her. Then I heard her tell another guest near the coffee urn, Frank was the real career Navy person in the family. Evelyn did nursing, of course, but Frank was the one people remember. I could have corrected her. I should have. Instead, I walked past with a plate of cake and said nothing. That was the first small cut. It was not the last. After retirement, Frank and I returned to Norfolk for good. We bought a brick house with a porch swing and a live oak that dropped leaves into the gutters no matter how often Frank cleaned them. We joined Street, Matthews Episcopal, volunteered at the Veterans Clinic, and started a scholarship fund for children of Navy corpsmen and nurses. The Mercer Service Scholarship began at our kitchen table with 3 folders, a coffee pot, and 1 check we could afford because we had spent more years saving than spending. Frank wanted both our names on it. I argued for his. He argued louder, as usual. "Evelyn," he said, tapping the table with his pen, "I drove ships. You brought people home alive. We are not building a monument to my ego." So the paperwork read the Frank and Evelyn Mercer Service Scholarship. For 10 years, that scholarship was the best thing we did together. We raised money through fish fries, church suppers, VFW raffles, and 1 annual Veterans Day dinner that grew from 40 people to more than 200. We helped nursing students, medics, corpsmen, and the children of military families who knew exactly what empty chairs cost. Mark and Paige became involved after Claire was born. At first, I was grateful. A family project can stitch together places words cannot reach. Mark handled the website, Paige organized donor tables and sponsorship levels. Frank charmed everyone. I wrote thank you letters, reviewed applications, and kept the service records straight. Then Frank got sick. It began with a cough he blamed on allergies, then fatigue. Then the doctor used the word lymphoma, and our lives narrowed to appointments, pill bottles, infusion chairs, insurance forms, and the sound of Frank pretending to be cheerful so I would not be afraid. I had cared for wounded sailors and dying men. None of that prepared me for watching my husband count the stairs before climbing them. Mark came more often during those months. So did Paige. They brought casseroles, drove Frank to treatments when I was too tired, and made sure Claire drew pictures for her grandfather's refrigerator. Grief, before it arrives, sometimes dresses itself as family unity. Frank died on a Tuesday morning in October with my hand in his and rain tapping the window. His last clear words to me came the night before. "Don't let them make you smaller because I am gone," he whispered. I told him to save his strength. He smiled. "Still giving orders, Captain." 3 weeks earlier, when he still had enough breath, he had asked me to bring him the old microcassette recorder from his desk. I thought he wanted to leave a message for Claire. He did, but he also left 1 for Mark, and 1 for the scholarship board, and 1 for me. I did not listen to all of them after he died. I could not. Grief has rooms you enter slowly. I placed the recorder in the blue service binder where I kept our scholarship documents, my service records, Frank's discharge papers, and copies of our foundation bylaws. Then I put the binder on the bottom shelf of my office bookcase. That binder became the object my son feared without understanding why. After the funeral, people came with pies, flowers, cards, and stories. They told me Frank was a good man. He was. They told me he had served honorably. He had. They told me I must be proud of his Navy legacy. I was, but fewer people asked about mine. At first, The imbalance did not bother me. Widowhood is exhausting. You learn to accept whichever condolences people know how to give. Frank had been louder, warmer, easier to celebrate. I had always been more private, if the town remembered him first. I understood. Then Paige began editing. A month after the funeral, she offered to update the scholarship website. Donors respond better to a clean story, she said at my kitchen table, scrolling through her tablet with manicured fingers. Frank as the decorated Navy officer, the devoted grandfather, the public servant. Very strong, very emotional. And me? I asked. She smiled without looking up. Of course, you will be included. As co-founder, widow, Navy nurse, captain, I said gently. She looked up then. I'm sorry? Retired Navy captain, nurse corps. Her smile tightened. Right, but for civilians, too many titles can be confusing. We don't want it to look like we are exaggerating. There it was again, a polite little blade. Mark was standing at the sink, rinsing coffee cups. He said nothing. The new website went live 2 weeks later. Frank's photograph was at the top. Mine was halfway down, cropped from a picture of the two of us, so only my shoulder and smile remained. The text described me as Frank's devoted wife, Evelyn, who supported his service and shared his commitment to military families. Supported his service. I read those words 3 times. Then I closed the laptop. I told myself not every slight required battle. That was my flaw. I confused restraint with peace. Sometimes it was wisdom, sometimes it was cowardice, dressed in good manners. The small cuts continued. At church, Paige corrected a woman who called me Captain Mercer. Oh, Evelyn doesn't use that, she said brightly. She prefers just Evelyn. Rank can make people uncomfortable after retirement. At a donor luncheon, Mark introduced Frank as the heart of the scholarship and me as mom, who keeps us organized. At Claire's school Veterans Day assembly, the teacher invited family veterans to stand. I began to rise. Paige touched my sleeve and whispered, maybe let Mark stand for Frank. It will mean more to Claire. I stayed seated. Claire looked back at me from the 3rd row. I still remember her face. Children notice what adults rename. The first time Mark suggested changing the scholarship name, we were sitting in my living room with the blue binder on the coffee table between us. He had brought documents printed on expensive paper. It's just branding. Mom, he said, the Captain Frank Mercer Memorial Scholarship has a stronger emotional pull. People give more when they can picture one hero. One hero, I repeated. He rubbed his forehead. You know what I mean. Dad was the public face, because I let him be. His mouth tightened. This is not about you being erased. That sentence told me he had considered it. Paige sat beside him with her ankles crossed. Evelyn, no one is questioning your contribution, but we also have to be realistic. Frank's story opens doors. Yours is more complicated. Complicated how? She glanced at Mark before answering. Military medical service is harder to explain to donors. They understand combat ships, command, sacrifice. Nursing sounds supportive. The room went so quiet I heard the refrigerator motor click on. Nurses can be commissioned officers, I said. Of course, Paige replied. No one said otherwise. But she had. Mark slid the papers toward me. We just need your signature to approve the name change and the new board structure. Paige would take over donor relations officially. I would serve as executive director. You would remain honorary chair. Honorary. Another word people use when they want your name without your authority. I opened the folder. The changes did more than rename the scholarship. They shifted control of funds, allowed the board to approve property-backed loans, and gave Mark authority to use my home office address as the foundation's registered headquarters. My house, Frank's memory, our scholarship, and my signature were being wrapped together with a ribbon of concern. I need time to review this, I said. Mark sighed. Mom, we've reviewed it. I haven't. His eyes hardened. You keep saying you want the scholarship to continue. This is how. I closed the folder. Not tonight? Paige's voice softened. Evelyn, grief can make decisions feel threatening. We are only trying to help. People who want your power often begin by questioning your capacity. After they left, I carried the papers to my office and opened the blue binder. The original bylaws were there. My name was not honorary. My signature was not ceremonial. The scholarship required my approval for any structural change. Frank had insisted on it. On the inside cover, in his handwriting, he had written, "No one edits Captain Mercer without Captain Mercer present." I sat at the desk and cried for the first time that week. Not because I was weak, because I was tired of being careful. 2 days later, Mark called. Have you signed? No. Why not? Because the documents shift control of the scholarship in ways your father never wanted. His laugh was short and bitter. Dad wanted it to survive. So do I. Then stop making this about your pride. There it was, the accusation beneath all the others. Pride. If I corrected my rank, it was pride. If I mentioned my service, it was confusion. If I protected the scholarship, it was stubbornness. If I questioned Paige, it was grief. Mark, I said, keeping my voice steady, I am willing to meet with the board, review the budget, and discuss improvements. I am not signing away authority. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Paige thinks we may need to talk to someone about your decision-making. My hand closed around the phone. Someone? An attorney? Maybe a doctor? Just to make sure you're not overwhelmed. I had listened to men under anesthesia say things with more subtlety. Do not threaten me with incompetence because I refuse to sign your papers. His voice rose. Nobody is threatening you. We are worried. You have been mixing up stories. What stories? The uniform, for one. Claire said you told her the blue jacket in your hall closet was yours. It is mine. He exhaled sharply. Mom, Dad wore navy dress blues. You were a nurse. The old pain in his voice did not excuse the ignorance. I was a Navy officer for 31 years. That jacket is mine. Your father's jacket is in the cedar chest. This is exactly what I mean, he said. I closed my eyes. You do not know how to read the rank. I know Dad was the captain. Your father retired as a commander. I retired as a captain. That silence was different. Not uncertainty. Refusal. I'm not doing this, he said finally. I won't let you rewrite Dad's life. He hung up. I stood in my kitchen with a dead phone in my hand and understood that my son did not merely misunderstand me. He needed to misunderstand me. His grief had built a statue of his father so tall there was no room for me beside it. Paige used that need like a key. The next Sunday, I arrived at church and found a folded bulletin on my usual pew. Inside was a small announcement for the upcoming Veterans Day dinner. The scholarship would honor Captain Frank Mercer and the next generation of service families. My name was not printed. After the service, I approached Reverend Wallace, a kind man who had buried my husband and cried at the graveside. Was this announcement submitted by the scholarship board? I asked. He adjusted his glasses and read it with visible discomfort. Paige sent it to the office, he said. I assumed. He did not finish. Assumptions are where erasure does its quietest work. Frank and I founded the scholarship together. I said, of course. I know that. Then why did the church print this? His face reddened. Evelyn, I am sorry. I should have checked. I believed him. But apologies after public harm do not unring bells. They only tell you who heard them. That afternoon, I opened the blue binder again. I read every bylaw, every amendment, every donor restriction. I reviewed bank statements, scholarship disbursements, meeting minutes, and emails. A pattern emerged. Over the previous 6 months, Paige had been sending donor updates that placed Frank at the center and reduced me to a grieving widow who had stepped back for health reasons. Health reasons. I had no health reason. She had also scheduled a private board vote for the morning after the Veterans Day dinner to approve the new structure, assuming my public humiliation would make resistance look unstable. That was the moment I moved from pain to mission. A mission is different from anger. Anger wants noise. Mission wants sequence. I called the one person I trusted to tell me when my heart was outrunning my judgment. Her name was Ruth Ann Bell, a retired Navy JAG officer who wore reading glasses on a chain and could make a grown man regret lying with only one raised eyebrow. Frank and I had known her for 20 years. She had helped us file the original scholarship paperwork. Ruth Ann answered on the third ring. Evelyn Mercer, she said. If you are calling me on a Sunday, someone has behaved foolishly. My son and daughter-in-law are trying to remove me from the scholarship. They are also telling people I am confused about my own service. The line went quiet. How foolishly? She asked. I told her everything. She did not interrupt. That was one reason I trusted her. When I finished, she said, first rule, do not argue with a smear while it is still fog. Make it choose a shape. Meaning? Let them put the lie in writing or on record. Then answer with documents. They have already printed some of it. Good. Keep copies. Good. Painful. Yes. Useful? Also, yes. Evelyn, you spent 31 years in uniform. You know this. A denial is not a strategy. A file is. I looked at the blue binder on my desk. I have the file. Then we build the ladder. Ruth Ann came over the next morning with a legal pad, a black pen, and a box of ginger cookies she claimed were for morale. We sat at my dining room table beneath the portrait of Frank in his dress whites. "We need 5 things," she said. "Your official records, foundation authority, proof of misrepresentation, witness support, and evidence of motive. Motive is control. Then we prove it with paper. People lie. Paper is less imaginative." We began with my records. My DD 214, officer service record, retirement orders, award citations, promotion, photograph, the old flight logbook with entries written in my own hand, the copy of the after-action summary mentioning the evacuation team, the photograph of Frank pinning the silver eagle on my shoulder. Ruth Ann handled each document with reverence that made my throat tighten. "You should not have had to defend this," she said. "I know. But since you do, we will do it properly." Next came foundation documents. The original articles of incorporation, the bylaws requiring my written approval, board minutes where Frank referred to us as co-founders, donor letters signed by both of us, scholarship checks from our joint account, photographs of early fundraisers in our backyard. Then we printed the recent website changes, the church bulletin, Paige's donor emails, and the proposed restructuring papers. Ruth Ann circled one paragraph with her pen. "Here," she said. "They describe you as having stepped back for health reasons. Did you authorize that?" "No." "Have you had any diagnosis affecting decision-making?" "No." "Good. We get a letter from your physician stating that—" I laughed once. "This is absurd." "Yes," she said, still writing. "Absurdity often becomes dangerous when no one answers it." That afternoon, we visited my doctor, a Navy veteran himself, who looked offended before I finished explaining. "Captain Mercer," Dr. Patel said, "I treated admirals who were less sharp than you on your worst day." He wrote a brief letter confirming I had no cognitive diagnosis and was fully capable of managing legal and financial affairs. He did not embellish. He did not need to. On the way home, Ruth Ann asked about living witnesses. I thought of Thomas Alvarez. We had exchanged Christmas cards for years after the war, then lost touch when he moved to Arizona. Frank had kept better records than I did. In the blue binder, behind the scholarship donor list, I found an old envelope with Tom's return address and a photograph from a reunion 20 years earlier. Tom stood beside me with a cane, one pant leg pinned neatly over a prosthetic limb, smiling like a man determined to make gratitude uncomfortable. On the back, in his handwriting, he had written, "Captain, every birthday after 24 has been extra. Thank you." I traced the words with my thumb. Ruth Ann found him through a veterans network in less than an hour. When I called, his voice was older but unmistakable. "Captain Mercer," he said, stretching the title into something between salute and affection. "I wondered when you would stop being too modest to call." I tried to explain the situation without sounding humiliated. He let out a low whistle. "Your boy said what?" "Not publicly yet, but he is close. Then I will be there." "Tom, I am not asking you to travel across the country." "Good, because I am not asking permission. You live in Arizona. Airplanes still fly, ma'am, unless the Navy has changed that too." For the first time in weeks, I laughed from my chest. His tone softened. "You saved my life, Captain. Let me help save your name." I could not answer immediately. "Tom," I said finally, "I never wanted this to become a spectacle." "Neither did I when I bled all over your aircraft," he replied. "Some spectacles become necessary because liars count on decent people avoiding them." That line stayed with me. Meanwhile, Mark escalated. He sent me an email with Paige copied. The subject line read, "Concern for Mom." I knew before opening it that the email was written for future readers, not for me. He said he loved me. He said grief had been difficult. He said I had become fixated on military titles and resistant to reasonable foundation updates. He said he was worried about me making public statements that might embarrass the family and damage Frank's legacy. Then came the sentence that chilled me. "If you continue opposing the board's efforts, Paige and I may have no choice but to seek legal guidance regarding temporary protective authority over your foundation and financial decisions." Temporary protective authority. That was a velvet glove around a fist. Ruth Ann read the email and smiled in a way that would have frightened younger attorneys. "He made the fog choose a shape," she said. She drafted a response that was brief, formal, and colder than January rain. It stated that I remained competent, legally authorized, and opposed to any name change or restructuring. It requested preservation of all communications, donor materials, financial records, and board correspondence related to the scholarship. "This will scare them," I said. "It should. He is still my son." Ruth Ann set the pen down. And you are still his mother. But motherhood is not consent to be defamed. I signed. Paige called within 20 minutes. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was smooth enough for a donor luncheon. Evelyn, this legal tone is unnecessary. We are family. Mark is devastated that you would treat him like an adversary. We are trying to honor Frank. Please do not make Veterans Day uncomfortable. People are coming to celebrate real sacrifice. Think about Claire. There it was again. Real sacrifice. I saved the voicemail. Over the next week, the pieces arranged themselves. Ruth Ann confirmed that the board had no authority to remove me without cause. Dr. Patel's letter addressed capacity. Tom booked a flight to Norfolk and insisted on paying for it himself. Reverend Wallace corrected the church bulletin the following Sunday and apologized to me from the pulpit in plain language. That took courage. It also made Paige furious. Mark stopped calling and started texting. Mom, you are making this worse. Mom, Dad would be ashamed. Mom, Paige is crying because of you. Mom, Claire is confused. The message about Claire nearly broke my discipline. I called him. He answered with a tired, suspicious tone. What? Do not use your daughter as a shield. She has questions because of you. She has questions because adults are feeding her half a story. He snapped. She asked me why Grandma thinks she outranked Grandpa. Do you know how ridiculous that sounds to a child? It sounds ridiculous because you never taught her the truth. The truth is, Dad was the hero in this family. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. There it was. Not branding, not donor strategy, not concern. The wound. Your father was a hero, I said. That never required me to be less than I was. His breathing changed. You were gone, he said. The words came out like they had been waiting 30 years. I know. You were always gone. Dad was there. Dad packed lunches. Dad came to games. Dad knew my friends. Dad was the parent. Then after he dies, suddenly everyone is supposed to clap for you too? I close my eyes. There are moments when a mother hears the child inside the grown man, and love becomes almost unbearable. Mark, I am sorry for every chair I left empty. He said nothing. I have carried that longer than you know. His voice hardened again, then stopped trying to take his place. I am not trying to take his place. I am trying to keep mine. You don't get both, he said. Then he hung up. I sat there a long time. Outside, wind moved through the live oak. The porch swing creaked once, though no one was sitting in it. I thought about calling him back. I thought about driving to his house. I thought about begging him to remember the postcards, the pancakes, the nights I came home exhausted and still sat beside his bed until he fell asleep. Then I looked at the blue binder. Love can explain a wound. It cannot be allowed to forge evidence. The Veterans Day dinner arrived cold and bright. I woke before dawn, though the event was not until evening. Military habits outlive uniforms. I made coffee, polished my shoes, and took my navy blue dress jacket from the closet. The jacket felt heavier than fabric should. It carried years. My name tape, my ribbons, the silver eagle insignia, the careful stitching, the faint smell of cedar, and time. For a moment, I considered wearing a simple black dress instead. Less provocative, Paige would have said, more dignified, easier for everyone. Then I remembered Frank's handwriting in the binder. No one edits Captain Mercer without Captain Mercer present. I wore the jacket. I also placed the blue service binder in a plain leather tote and tucked the microcassette recorder inside the pocket. Ruth Ann told me not to reveal the recording unless necessary. Documents first, she said. Witness second. Recording last. Let them choose how much truth they require. Tom Alvarez arrived at my house at 3 p.m. He stepped from a rideshare wearing a dark suit, polished shoes, and a Marine Corps lapel pin. He leaned on a cane but moved with the stubborn dignity of a man who had spent decades refusing pity. When I opened the door, he straightened. Captain, he said. Gunny. We stood there smiling like time had folded. He looked past me into the hallway where my uniform photograph hung beside Frank's. Good, he said. They are both up there. For now. For always. If people have sense. Ruth Ann arrived 10 minutes later with a briefcase and the expression of a woman hoping someone would be foolish enough to underestimate her. At 5:30, we drove to the Norfolk Veterans Hall together. The building had been cleaned until the floor smelled of wax and coffee. American flags lined the walls. Service caps rested on several tables. At the entrance, volunteers handed out printed programs with Frank's portrait on the cover. Only Frank's portrait. Below it, in bold letters, the program read, Honoring the Legacy of Captain Frank Mercer. My name appeared inside on the donor acknowledgement page as Evelyn Mercer, founding supporter. Founding supporter. Ruth Ann read it over my shoulder. That was unwise of them, she said. It was intentional. That too. Paige spotted us first. She wore a cream dress and pearls, her smile stretched tight enough to crack. Her eyes went from my jacket to the binder in my hand to Tom, whom she did not recognize. Evelyn, she said, kissing the air near my cheek. You look formal. It is Veterans Day. Of course. I only worry that all the decorations might be confusing to guests. Tom coughed once into his fist. It sounded suspiciously like a laugh. Paige turned to him. I'm sorry. Have we met? No, ma'am. He said pleasantly. Not yet. Ruth Ann offered no introduction. Paige's eyes returned to me. Your table is near the back. We thought it would be easier for you. Less noise. My place card was at the family table yesterday. We had to adjust for donors. You understand. I looked toward the front. Mark stood beside a large easel holding Frank's portrait. Claire sat at the front table in a navy dress, swinging her feet beneath the chair. When she saw me, her face brightened, then clouded when Paige touched her shoulder and whispered something. That small gesture hurt more than the program. I took the back seat near the kitchen doors. Not because Paige had assigned it, because I wanted the room to see the distance she had created. Ruth Ann sat on my left. Tom sat 2 tables behind Mark, at an angle where he could see the stage. He placed both hands on top of his cane and waited. The dinner began with a pledge, then a prayer. Then the mayor spoke about service in the language politicians use when they mean well but have never had to pack a sea bag. The post commander spoke next. He mentioned Frank warmly. He did not mention me. I watched Mark's shoulders relax. He believed the room had accepted the edited version. Then Paige walked to the microphone. Tonight, she said, we honor a man whose sacrifice shaped this community. Captain Frank Mercer represented everything noble about service, family, and legacy. Frank had been a commander, not a captain, but civilians often use captain loosely around the Navy. Paige knew better by then. That was why she said it. She described his character, his humor, his devotion to Claire. Much of it was true. That made the lie harder to hear. Lies do not always arrive alone. Sometimes they hide inside accurate sentences. Then she turned toward my table. This year has been difficult for Evelyn, she said. Grief can blur memory. It can make us reach for symbols that comfort us, even when those symbols belong to someone else. The room shifted. People glanced at me, then away. Ruth Ann's pen moved across her notepad. Paige continued, voice soft as a hymn. As a family, we are learning how to protect Frank's legacy while also protecting Evelyn's dignity. We ask for grace tonight. Grace. Another beautiful word used badly. Mark came to the microphone after her. He looked pale, but determined. For a moment, I saw the boy in dinosaur pajamas asking why other people got more of me than he did. Then he lifted my dress jacket from the chair where Paige had placed it near the stage. I had not noticed it there when we entered. Later, I would learn that Paige had asked Claire to bring it from my hall closet weeks earlier for a display of family service items. Claire thought she was helping. Mark held it up. The silver eagle flashed beneath the lights. My mother has been confused since Dad passed, he said. And the hook became reality. I listened as my son accused me of wearing medals I had not earned, of letting people believe the jacket belonged to me, of using grief to insert myself into Frank's story. He did not call me a liar. That would have been too crude. He called me confused, which was more useful. Tonight is about real service, he said, not memory problems. At the front table, Claire looked stricken. The post commander frowned, but did not interrupt. That silence gave Mark more power than the microphone did. When he finished, applause did not come. Not really. A few polite hands tapped, then stopped. Most people stared at their plates. I rose slowly. The room turned toward me. Paige stepped quickly to the microphone. Evelyn, please. We don't need to do this publicly. You began publicly, I said. My voice carried farther than I expected. Mark lowered the jacket but did not release it. I walked from the back table to the center aisle with the blue binder against my chest. My knees ached. My hands did not shake. Halfway down the aisle, Claire whispered, Grandma? I looked at her. Listen carefully, sweetheart. Not to anger, to facts. Ruth Ann rose behind me and moved to the side of the room. Tom remained seated, watching. I reached the stage and stopped below my son. I did not climb the steps. I wanted the room to see him above me with the microphone and me below him with the record. Mark, I said, before I answer, I want to ask you one question. Do you know the difference between a Navy commander and a Navy captain? His jaw tightened. This is not the time for technicalities. Rank is not a technicality in a veterans hall. The first crack moved through the room. A few heads lifted. I turned to the post commander. Commander Ellis, would you please answer? The older man shifted in his seat. He looked uncomfortable, but not dishonest. A Navy captain outranks a commander, he said. And the insignia for a Navy captain? He looked at the jacket in Mark's hands. A silver eagle. The room followed his gaze. I turned back to my son. Your father retired as a commander. His insignia was a silver oak leaf. That jacket has a silver eagle because it is mine. Mark looked down at the collar as if the bird had appeared there by magic. Paige stepped forward. Evelyn, this is exactly the kind of confusion we are concerned about. Frank was commonly called captain because he commanded a ship division. The public doesn't need to understand every military detail. The public is not the problem, Ruth Ann said from the side. Misrepresentation is... People turned toward her. Paige's smile vanished. And you are? Ruth Ann Bell, retired Navy JAG. Counsel for Captain Evelyn Mercer and the Frank and Evelyn Mercer Service Scholarship. The word counsel changed the room faster than any raised voice could have. I opened the blue binder. This is my certified record of service, I said. United States Navy Nurse Corps, 31 years, retired at the rank of captain. These are my retirement orders. This is my DD, 214. This is my award citation. This is a photograph of my husband, pinning the silver eagle on my shoulder. I handed the first packet to Commander Ellis. His face tightened as he read. The mayor leaned toward him. The retired admiral at the front table stood and walked over without being asked. Admiral Catherine Sloan had been quiet all evening. She was in her 70s, straight-backed, white-haired, and famous in Norfolk for tolerating nonsense poorly. She took the documents from Commander Ellis and read the top page. Then she looked at me. Captain Mercer, she said clearly, I apologize. I should have asked why your name was missing from the program. You could hear the air leave the room. Mark's face reddened. Admiral, with respect, these documents may not be what she thinks they are. The Admiral turned to him slowly. With respect, Mr. Mercer, I can read a service record. A small sound moved through the tables. Not laughter, not applause. Recognition. Paige tried to recover. No one is denying Evelyn served. The concern is that she has been blending her service with Frank's legacy in ways that confuse donors and family members. Ruth Ann lifted a folder. Since you mentioned donors, perhaps we should discuss the materials your office sent describing Captain Mercer as having stepped back for health reasons. Paige went still. Mark looked at her. That was the first time I saw uncertainty pass between them. Ruth Ann handed copies to the mayor, the post commander, and 2 board members seated near the front. Captain Mercer did not authorize those statements, Ruth Ann said. Her physician has confirmed in writing that she has no cognitive diagnosis and remains fully competent to manage her affairs. The Foundation bylaws also require her approval for any name change or restructuring. The acting board treasurer, a retired school principal named Mrs. Henson, stood with the program clutched in her hand. Paige, she said, you told us Evelyn wanted a smaller role. Paige's eyes flicked toward the reporters. She did, Paige said. In spirit, she has been overwhelmed. Do not translate my silence into consent, I said. The room quieted again. Mark stepped down from the stage, still holding the jacket. His voice was lower now, meant only for me, but the microphone caught part of it. Mom, stop. You're humiliating yourself. I looked at the jacket between us. No, I said. You are discovering me. That is different. Tom Alvarez stood. At first, people noticed only the cane. Then they noticed the way he carried himself. He moved slowly toward the aisle, each step precise. When he reached the open space near the stage, he faced Mark. May I speak? He asked. Mark stared at him. Who are you? Tom smiled without warmth. One of the men your mother supposedly imagined. The retired admiral moved to the microphone. State your name, please. Thomas Rafael Alvarez. Gunnery Sergeant, United States Marine Corps. Retired. Service-connected, disabled, and alive. Because Captain Evelyn Mercer decided I was not dying on her watch. The room went absolutely still. Tom turned, not to me, but to Claire. Young lady, I was 24 years old when your grandmother held my artery closed with her hands in the back of a military aircraft. I was scared enough to beg. She looked me in the eye and told me, not today. I have had a wife, 3 children, 6 grandchildren, and 44 extra birthdays because she knew her job and did it under conditions most people in this room would never want to see. Claire's mouth trembled. Mark whispered, this is not necessary. Tom faced him. Son, it became necessary the minute you used the microphone to call her honor a symptom. No one moved. Tom reached into his jacket and removed an old photograph. He held it up. It was the reunion picture from 20 years earlier, the same one with his handwriting on the back. I carried this in my Bible for 2 decades, he said. That is your mother standing beside me. Not beside your father, not behind your father, beside me, because her service is not a footnote to his. Paige's face had lost its color. Still, she tried one more time. Mr. Alvarez, no one doubts your gratitude, but this event is about Frank's memorial scholarship. We cannot allow an emotional misunderstanding to derail donor confidence. Ruth Ann's voice cut through the room. Donor confidence has already been affected by false statements, unauthorized materials, and a proposed governance change that would benefit you and your husband directly. The board treasurer looked sharply at Paige. Benefit how? Ruth Ann opened another folder. The restructuring documents would allow the executive director to approve administrative contracts with related parties. Paige Mercer registered a consulting company 2 months ago. The proposed donor relations contract lists that company as eligible for a monthly fee. Mark turned to Paige. What contract? There it was. The second crack, deeper than the first. Paige spoke quickly. It was a draft. Standard nonprofit administration. Nothing was approved. Because I did not sign, I said. The board treasurer sank slowly into her chair. The mayor removed his glasses. One reporter lowered her phone and began typing with both thumbs. Mark looked lost for the first time. Not ashamed yet. Lost. The story he had trusted was changing shape faster than he could defend it. He looked at me. Did you know about this? I knew enough to say no. His eyes moved to the jacket in his hands. For a moment, I thought it was over. But lies that have stood in public rarely collapse all at once. They claw for one more ledge. Mark lifted his chin. Even if Mom served honorably, he said, voice strained. Dad wanted this scholarship to carry his name. He told me that. He said people connected to his story. I felt the room lean toward that sentence. It was harder to disprove. The dead cannot raise their hands. Except Frank, stubborn even in death, had left us his voice. I looked at Ruth Ann. She gave one small nod. I reached into the binder pocket and took out the microcassette recorder. It was old, black, and scratched near the speaker. Frank had used it for grocery reminders after he refused to learn the voice memo app on his phone. Mark stared at it as if I had pulled a weapon from the past. Your father recorded messages before he died, I said. I did not want to play this publicly. I hoped records would be enough. I hoped your own heart would be enough. My voice almost broke then. I let it steady. But you have used his name to erase mine. So tonight, he will answer you. I pressed play. For 2 seconds, there was only static. Then Frank's voice filled the hall, weaker than any of us wanted to remember, but unmistakably his. This is Frank Mercer. If this is being played for the scholarship board, then Evelyn has probably tried to be gracious longer than I would have advised. A few people laughed softly through tears. Mark's face collapsed. The recording continued. The scholarship was founded by both of us. That was not sentimental wording. It was fact. Evelyn reviewed the first applications at our kitchen table while I burned coffee and pretended to understand the filing system. Her service inspired the nursing awards. Her record brought in half our early donors. Her judgment kept us honest. If anyone tries to remove her name, reduce her authority, or suggest she was only my helper, they are not honoring me. They are disobeying me. My hand tightened around the recorder. Frank coughed on the tape. I heard myself in the background asking if he wanted water. Then his voice returned. Mark, if you are hearing this, listen to your old man one last time. Your mother missed things. She knows that. I know that. You have carried hurt, and I should have helped you speak it sooner. But do not punish her service because childhood made you lonely. She wore the uniform. She earned the eagle. She earned the medals. And she earned better from her son than suspicion dressed up as protection. Claire began to cry. Mark covered his mouth. On the tape, Frank's voice softened. Claire, sweetheart, if you are there, remember this. Families do not become stronger by shrinking one person to make another look tall. Your grandmother is not taking anything from me when people honor her. I loved standing beside her. I still do. The tape clicked, then continued a final time. Put both names on the scholarship. Keep both photographs on the wall. Tell the truth even when it complicates the story, especially then. Truth is the only legacy worth leaving. The recorder stopped. No one spoke. Not the mayor, not the commander, not the reporters, not Paige, not Mark. Silence after truth is different from silence after cruelty. One hides, the other absorbs. Claire left her chair and ran to me. She wrapped her arms around my waist and pressed her face against my jacket. "I'm sorry, Grandma," she sobbed. "I didn't know." I held her with one arm and the recorder with the other. "You are a child," I whispered. "The truth was never your burden to carry." Mark stood a few feet away, empty-handed now. At some point, he had lowered the jacket onto a chair. He looked younger than I had seen him in years. "Mom," he said. It was only one word, but it carried 30 years of damage. I was not ready to comfort him. Admiral Sloane stepped to the microphone. She did not ask permission. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, voice clear enough to cut glass, "the record should be corrected immediately. The officer present tonight is Captain Evelyn Mercer, United States Navy Nurse Corps, retired. Her service is documented. Her rank is documented. Her awards are documented. The uniform displayed tonight is hers." She paused and looked at the program in her hand. "Furthermore, any veterans organization or foundation that benefits from service history has a duty to state that history accurately. I regret that I did not insist on that accuracy before this evening. I will not repeat that failure." Commander Ellis stood next. His face was red. "Captain Mercer," he said into the microphone, "on behalf of this post, I apologize for allowing a question about your honor to be raised in this hall without first asking for the record. That was wrong." He turned toward Mark. "And Mr. Mercer, you owe your mother an apology that does not include the word but." Mark flinched. Paige stepped away from him. That small movement told me everything. She had been willing to stand beside him when he controlled the room, not when the room turned. The board treasurer approached Ruth Ann and asked for copies of the documents. Ruth Ann handed them over neatly, as if she had been waiting all evening for someone to request the obvious. The mayor spoke with the reporters. The reporter from the Virginian Pilot asked Admiral Sloane how to spell Navy Nurse Corps properly. Someone near the back began clapping. One person, then another. I wish they had not. Applause can feel strange when it arrives where protection should have been. Still, people stood. Not everyone. Enough. Tom Alvarez saluted me. I returned it. Mark watched that salute as if it explained a language he had refused to learn. The dinner did not continue as planned. How could it? Donors gathered in worried knots. Board members whispered urgently. Paige disappeared into the hallway with her phone. Ruth Ann stayed beside me, one hand on the binder like a guard at a gate. Claire refused to leave my side. A few people approached to apologize. Some apologies were specific and therefore bearable. I should have asked why your title was missing. I repeated what Paige told me. "I am sorry. I saw your face at church and still said nothing." Those I accepted. Others were fog. This must be so hard. Families are complicated. I'm sure everyone meant well. Those I let pass without granting comfort. Meaning well does not repair public harm. Naming it does. Mark approached me after most guests had moved toward the lobby. Paige was not with him. His tie was crooked. His eyes were wet. "Mom," he said again. Claire tightened her grip on my hand. I looked down at her. "Go sit with Mr. Alvarez for a minute, sweetheart. I need to speak with your father." She hesitated. "It's all right," I said. "Adults need to tell the truth now." She went to Tom, who welcomed her with a gentle nod and began showing her the old photograph. Mark and I stood beneath the stage lights, near the chair where my jacket lay. "I didn't know," he said. "You did not ask." He swallowed. "Paige told me the rank thing was complicated. She said Dad was the one donors knew. She said you were making it about yourself. And you believed her because part of you wanted to—" His face twisted. I was angry. "I know. You were gone so much. I know that too. Dad was there." "Yes." He looked almost offended that I did not defend myself. I continued, "Your father was there in ways I could not be. That is true. It is also true that I loved you, served honorably, helped build this scholarship, and earned every item on that jacket. Your pain did not cancel my life." He wiped his face with one hand. "I called you confused." "Yes." "In front of everyone." "Yes." I let Claire think. His voice broke. That was the first honest grief I had heard from him in years. He reached toward me, then stopped because he finally understood he no longer had the right to assume comfort. "I am sorry," he said. "I am sorry for accusing you of wearing medals you earned. I am sorry for moving your name out of the scholarship. I am sorry for using Dad's memory against you. I am sorry for letting my hurt become disrespect." It was the first apology that named the harm. I nodded once. "I hear you." Hope flashed in his face, quick and dangerous. "Can we fix this?" "Not tonight." The hope faded. "Mom," Forgiveness may come, trust will require behavior. The board will meet without Paige's materials. Ruth Ann will review everything. You will step down from any authority over the scholarship until the review is complete. You will tell Claire the truth yourself. Not the soft version. The honest one. And you will not ask me to make this easier for you by pretending it hurt less than it did. He closed his eyes. Okay, he whispered. That is the boundary. He nodded. I picked up my jacket from the chair. For a moment, his hand hovered as if he wanted to help. He thought better of it. Good. Some respect begins by not reaching. The next morning, the story appeared online before my coffee finished brewing. The headline was more dramatic than I would have chosen, but less false than many. Widow accused at Veterans Dinner, confirmed as decorated Navy captain and scholarship co-founder. There were photographs. Mark at the microphone. Me in the aisle with the blue binder. Admiral Sloan reading my records. Tom Alvarez saluting. Claire holding my hand. By noon, my phone was full of messages. Some came from old Navy friends. Some came from nurses I had trained. Some came from people who had attended the dinner and wanted to apologize now that apology had become socially safe. Ruth Ann advised me not to respond to everyone. Public correction is not the same as personal access, she said. The foundation board held an emergency meeting that afternoon at my dining room table because I refused to enter the office. Paige had reorganized without my consent. Frank's portrait remained on the wall. Beside it, I placed my promotion photograph. 2 uniforms, 2 histories. 1 truth. Paige did not attend. Her attorney sent a statement claiming she had acted in good faith based on family concerns. Ruth Ann read it aloud with such dryness that Tom, still in town, nearly choked on his coffee. Mark attended. He looked exhausted and ashamed. He did not sit at the head of the table. That mattered. The board voted unanimously to suspend the proposed restructuring, restore the scholarship name, remove unauthorized donor materials, and commission an independent review of finances and communications. Paige's consulting company was barred from any contract. Mark voluntarily stepped down as acting executive director pending review. Mrs. Henson, the treasurer, cried when she apologized. I liked the simple story, she said. Frank as the hero, you as the gracious widow. It made fundraising easy. I did not stop to ask whether easy was honest. That apology stayed with me because it named more than a mistake. It named the temptation. Easy stories are dangerous when they require someone to disappear. The review took 6 weeks. It found no stolen scholarship money, which relieved me more than I can say. But it did find unauthorized donor messaging, improper proposed conflicts of interest, and repeated efforts by Paige to centralize control through Mark. The board accepted Ruth Ann's recommendations. New conflict policies were adopted. Any public materials involving service history would require documentary review. Board seats would rotate. No family member could hold paid executive authority without independent approval. Paige resigned from all volunteer roles before the findings became public. Her resignation letter was 2 paragraphs long and included the phrase misunderstood intentions 3 times. I did not save it. Mark and Paige separated in January. He did not tell me immediately. Claire did, in the way children reveal adult earthquakes while asking for toast. Dad sleeps in the guest room now, she said one Saturday morning at my kitchen counter. Mom says everyone is being dramatic. I buttered her toast carefully. How are you feeling about that? She shrugged. Too old for the truth and too young for the lie. I don't know. Dad cries in the garage. I set the knife down. Adults can make very painful messes, I said. You are not responsible for cleaning them. She looked toward the hallway where my dress jacket now hung in a glass front cabinet beside Frank's uniform. The blue binder rested on the shelf below them. Grandma, she asked, were you scared when Dad said that stuff? I thought about giving the brave answer. Children deserve better. Yes. But you didn't look scared. Training helps. So does knowing the truth. She considered that. Mom said you embarrassed Dad. Your father embarrassed himself by saying something untrue in public. I corrected it in public because that is where he said it. Claire nodded slowly. He told me he was wrong. My throat tightened. Good. He said when he was little, he missed you so much it turned into being mad. That can happen. Did you miss him? I sat beside her. Every day I was away. Every single day. She leaned against my arm, and for a moment the kitchen held 3 generations of sorrow, without needing to solve all of it. In February, Mark asked if we could meet alone. I chose a public place. Not because I feared him, but because boundaries need rooms that support them. We met at a small diner near the naval base where Frank and I used to eat, after medical appointments. The waitress poured coffee without asking, because some places remember grief by remembering your order. Mark arrived early. He stood when I approached. That was new. Captain, he said softly. I looked at him. He flushed. I mean, Mom, I don't know how to do this right. Start with honest. Right can come later. We sat. For a while, he stirred his coffee, though he drank it black. Finally, he said, Paige pushed some things, but I let her because they matched what I already felt. I need you to know I understand that now. I listened. I was jealous of a dead man's memory and angry at a living woman, he said. That is a shameful thing to admit. It is a human thing to admit. Shameful depends on what you do after admitting it. He looked at me then. Dad left me a recording too. I knew. Frank had told me there were 3. Did you listen? Mark nodded. His eyes filled. He said I had mistaken availability for love and absence for abandonment. He said both of you loved me differently and imperfectly. He told me to stop making you pay for every night he was the one home. I looked out the window at traffic moving past the diner. Frank, still parenting from a cassette recorder. It would have made him insufferably pleased. Mark continued, I am in counseling. Claire and I are going too. Paige refuses. That is part of why. He stopped. You do not owe me details of your marriage, I said. I know. I just want you to know I am trying to change something, not just apologize. That mattered. Regret speaks. Repair behaves. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a folded paper on the table. It was a copy of a letter he had sent to the foundation board, donors, church office, and Veterans Hall. In it, he corrected the record plainly. He stated that I was a retired Navy captain, co-founder of the scholarship, and rightful authority in its governance. He admitted his public statements had been false and harmful. He did not blame grief. He did not blame Paige. He did not use the word confusion except to say it had been wrongly applied to me. I read every line. Then I looked at him. This is a beginning. He nodded. I know. Not a finish. I know that too. We drank coffee. We talked about Claire's school, his counseling, the scholarship review, and Frank's old habit of buying cereal no one liked because it was on sale. We did not become healed in one morning. Life does not respect that kind of storytelling. But when we left, Mark walked me to my car and did not try to hug me until I opened my arms first. That, too, was the beginning. Spring came slowly to Norfolk. The live oak dropped leaves, then grew new ones as if contradicting itself was part of survival. The scholarship board planned a second ceremony, smaller than Veterans Day, to award the year's grants and formally correct the public record. I resisted at first. We already had enough spectacle, I told Ruth Ann. She looked over her glasses. This is not spectacle. It is repair. Public harm requires public repair. So we held it in April at the Veterans Hall, the same room, though this time my place card sat at the front table beside Frank's photograph and my own. The program cover read, the Frank and Evelyn Mercer Service Scholarship. Under our names were 2 lines. Commander Frank Mercer, United States Navy, retired. Captain Evelyn Mercer, United States Navy Nurse Corps, retired. Accurate, simple, late. Before the ceremony began, I stood alone near the stage and looked toward the back table by the kitchen doors. A volunteer was setting water glasses there. The chair where I had sat on Veterans Day looked ordinary now. That is the strange thing about places of humiliation. They do not stay dramatic. They become wood, fabric, floor wax, fluorescent light. The memory lives in you, not in the chair. Tom Alvarez returned for the ceremony with his wife, Elena. Claire adored him by then and had begun writing him letters for a school history project. He told her stories that were age-appropriate and still honest, which is harder than most adults realize. Admiral Sloan gave the opening remarks. Accuracy is not politeness, she said. It is duty. Tonight, this foundation fulfills a duty it should never have neglected. Then she invited me to speak. I walked to the microphone. For a moment, I saw Mark standing there months earlier with my jacket in his hands. I saw Claire's frightened face. I heard Frank's thin recorded voice. I felt again the strange loneliness of being doubted in a room designed to honor truth. Then I looked at the scholarship recipients seated in the front row. There were 4 of them. A corpsman's daughter going to nursing school. A Marine veteran retraining as a physician assistant. A sailor's son studying social work. And a 52-year-old widow named Bernadette who had spent 30 years raising children through deployments and had finally enrolled in college because, as she wrote in her application, I am not finished becoming useful. That line nearly undid me. I leaned toward the microphone. When my husband and I began the scholarship, I said we did not intend to build a monument to either of us. We wanted to honor the people who serve, the people who heal, and the families who keep loving through absence, fear, and change. Service is not one shape. Sacrifice is not one uniform. Some command ships. Some hold pressure on wounds. Some raise children alone during deployments. Some begin again at 52. Bernadette wiped her eyes. I continued. Tonight, the record is correct. I am grateful for that. But I want to say something especially to the families in this room. Do not wait for a ceremony to respect the people at your own table. Do not make a person produce documents before you believe the life they lived. Ask, listen, tell the truth while the people who earned it are still here to hear it. The room was quiet. My husband used to say truth is the only legacy worth leaving. He was right. And if this scholarship does anything after we are gone, let it help people build lives that do not require anyone else to be erased. I stepped back. This time, when applause came, I led it. Mark stood in the front row with Claire. He did not clap first. He waited, maybe because he understood applause was not his cue to lead. Then he joined quietly. After the awards, he approached the microphone. This had not been in the program. He looked at me first, asking permission without words. I gave the smallest nod. He faced the room. My name is Mark Mercer, he said. Most of you know me as Frank's son. I am also Evelyn Mercer's son. I failed to honor that properly. In this room last November, I made false statements about my mother's service and her capacity. I allowed my grief and resentment to become public disrespect. I apologized to Captain Mercer, to my daughter, to this foundation, and to every veteran in this room. My father was worthy of honor. My mother is too... I should never have acted as though one truth threatened the other. His voice shook, but he did not stop. I am stepping away from leadership until trust is rebuilt through action, not words. Thank you for allowing me to correct the record in the same room where I damaged it. He returned to his seat. No one applauded immediately. I was grateful. Some statements need silence before response. Then Mrs. Henson stood. Others followed. It was not the roaring approval people chase. It was sober, measured, adult. The kind of respect that understands something costly has happened. Afterward, Claire led me to the hallway where the hall had installed a new display case. I had not known about it. Inside were 2 uniforms. Frank's dress jacket on the left, mine on the right. Beneath Frank's was his service description, accurate down to rank. Beneath mine was mine. Between them sat my father's compass, which I had loaned for the display, and a small engraved plate. It read, "Respect should begin before evidence is required." I looked at Claire. "Did you do this?" She smiled through tears. I helped pick the words. Admiral Sloan said, "They sounded like you." Mark stood a few feet behind her. He did not intrude. He simply watched. "Grandma," Claire said, "when my class does Veterans Day next year, will you come?" "If I am invited." She frowned, offended by the condition. "You are invited. I'm inviting you now, and I'm telling them your full rank." I laughed softly. "Then I will come." That summer, the scholarship checks went out on time. Bernadette sent me a photograph from her first day of class, standing outside the community college with a backpack and a grin big enough to challenge anyone who thought life had an expiration date. Tom sent postcards from Arizona. Ruth Ann threatened to retire again, which no one believed. Mark kept going to counseling. He and Paige divorced in September. I will not pretend that made me happy. Divorce is not a victory when a child is involved. But their home became calmer afterward, and Claire stopped asking questions with her shoulders raised. Paige moved to Richmond and took a nonprofit consulting position with people who I hope read contracts carefully. She sent one email to me months later. It said she regretted how things unfolded. That was all. I did not respond. Not every closed door needs a speech through it. Mark and I repaired slowly. He came by on Saturdays to clean the gutters, though I suspect guilt climbed the ladder more often than necessity. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we worked in the yard without forcing conversation. He asked me about the Navy in pieces. Never, all at once. I told him about safe things first. Funny things. Bad coffee. Flight suits that never fit correctly. Frank getting seasick and denying it. Eventually, I told him harder things. Not to punish him. To let him know me. One afternoon, he found a box of postcards in the attic. Every card I had sent him from deployments was there, bundled with rubber bands so old they broke when touched. He sat on the attic floor reading them, dust on his jeans, silence around him. "Dad saved these," he said. He saved everything. Mark held up one from Bahrain with a cartoon camel on the front. On the back, in my handwriting, it said, "Dear Mark, I missed your science fair today. Dad said, your volcano worked so well the teacher moved it outside. I am proud of you. I am sorry I could not stand beside you. I love you from here to every star you can see. Mom. He wiped his face with the heel of his hand. I didn't know you wrote this many. You were young. Your father read some to you. Others he kept until you were ready, I think. I was angry for so long. I know. It feels like I wasted years. I sat on an old trunk across from him. Years are not wasted if truth finally teaches them what bitterness could not. He looked at the postcards again. Can I keep these? They were always yours. Repair did not erase Veterans Day. I would not want it to. Painful truth, once faced, becomes a boundary marker. It tells you where you will never return. The following November, Claire's school invited veterans to speak. I wore my dress jacket, the same one Mark had held up as accusation 1 year earlier. My silver eagle caught the auditorium light. My ribbons sat where they belonged. Claire introduced me herself. This is my grandmother, Captain Evelyn Mercer, United States Navy Nurse Corps, retired, she said, reading carefully from an index card. She helped bring wounded service members home, and she says nurses can be officers and heroes can have quiet voices. The parents applauded. The children looked mostly interested in getting to lunch. That was fine. Children should not have to understand everything too soon. After my brief talk, a little boy raised his hand. Were you scared? He asked. I smiled. Many times. Then how were you brave? I thought of aircraft noise, hospital corridors, Mark's face in the Veterans Hall, Claire's arms around my waist, Frank's voice on the recorder. Being brave does not mean you are not scared, I said. It means you do the truthful thing while fear is present. Claire beamed like I had answered correctly on a test she had secretly written. After the assembly, Mark met us outside. He carried 3 cups of coffee, one for me, one for his teacher friend who had organized the event, and hot chocolate for Claire. Small preparations. Ordinary care. The kind of love that shows up early and carries things. He looked at my jacket. It looks right, he said. It always did. He nodded. I know. I am sorry it took me so long to see it. I accepted that without making him bleed for it again. On Veterans Day evening, exactly 1 year after the dinner, we gathered at my house instead of the hall. No microphone, no reporters, no printed program. Just Mark, Claire, Ruth Ann, Tom, and Elena visiting from Arizona, Reverend Wallace, and a few scholarship recipients who had become family in the way shared purpose sometimes allows. We ate pot roast because it was Frank's favorite, though he had always pretended mine needed more salt. After dinner, Claire asked to hear her grandfather's recording again. I hesitated. Mark looked at me. Only if you want to. That sentence, simple as it was, showed repair. I brought out the microcassette recorder and placed it on the table. The plastic was more scratched now, the little buttons clicked louder than memory should. Frank's voice filled the kitchen again. We listened, not as a weapon this time, but as a witness whose work was finally done. When the tape ended, no one spoke for a while. Then Tom lifted his coffee cup. To both Mercers, he said. To both, Mark repeated. Claire looked at the hallway display where Frank's photograph hung beside mine. Beneath them, on a small shelf, sat my father's compass. She picked it up carefully and held it in her palm. Which way does it point? She asked. North. I said, always, if it is working. She considered that with the seriousness of a child who had learned more than adults intended. Maybe truth is like that, she said. It points the same way even when people don't follow it. No sermon I could have given would have been better. After everyone left, Mark stayed to help with dishes. He washed, I dried. We moved around each other in the old kitchen, beneath the soft light, with the comfort of people learning a new rhythm. Mom, he said after a while. Yes. Thank you for not giving up on me. I placed the plate in the cabinet. I came close. He nodded, accepting the truth. What stopped you? I looked toward the hallway, where the blue binder rested under glass now. No longer hidden, no longer waiting to defend me. A mother can draw a boundary without closing her heart, I said. It just takes longer to learn than people think. He dried his hands on a towel. Do you forgive me? The question had changed since the diner. Then he had wanted relief. Now he wanted truth. Yes, I said, his eyes closed. Do you trust me? I was quiet long enough for him to understand the answer would not be easy. More than I did, not as much as I may one day. He nodded again. That is fair. Fair is not always warm, but it can be clean. We needed clean before we could have warm. When he left, I walked to the porch with him. The night air smelled of leaves and distant rain. Claire was already in the car, waving through the window. Mark paused at the steps. Good night, Captain, he said. This time, there was no awkwardness in it. Good night. Son, after the car pulled away, I remained on the porch. The live oak shifted above me. Somewhere down the street, a flag rope tapped against a metal pole. I thought about the young nurse I had been, the wife I became, the mother who failed and loved and tried again, the widow who nearly allowed politeness to bury her name. The world had not changed as much as people think it does after truth comes out. My knees still ached. The gutters still needed cleaning. Frank was still gone. Mark and I still had years of careful rebuilding ahead. Some people still preferred the simpler version of the story because simple stories require less courage. But the record was corrected. My granddaughter knew both names. The scholarship carried the truth forward. And my uniform, once held up as proof of confusion, now rested beside my husband's in a hall where children could read for themselves. Respect should never have required a binder, a witness, and a dead man's voice on an old cassette. But once truth had witnesses, no one could make me small again.